Hello there, and a genuinely sincere welcome this week to DF Direct Weekly in what is our 183rd edition. Lots to get through as per usual. Joining me on the panel, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, should be a fun week talking about Nintendo and a new Sony remake. There are a little bit too many of those recently, but it should be fun to have a chat.
And Alex Battaglia, hello.
Yeah, this could just be like a weekly fill-in program where we have on the docket next Sony remake / remaster. Nintendo does things we don't like. Or Microsoft, one of those two.
Or Nvidia.
Or Nvidia. Or AMD, yes.
Or Intel, yeah. We're going to try not to moan too much though, but with that, let's completely disregard that by talking about our first news topic. So this is just kind of getting a bit out of hand now. Obviously, Nintendo has proven to be quite litigious in recent times, most recently with its takedown of the Yuzu emulator for Nintendo Switch. Now, at the time, we thought there were possibly some good reasons as to why they were able to pursue that route, principally that Yuzu was demonstrating brand new Switch games that hadn't even come out yet being run at higher resolutions and better performance levels on their emulator, pre-launched, which isn't great. However, now we have the takedown of Ryujinx. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Pretty much the only other working Switch emulator. According to people who are familiar with the situation, obviously this is effectively hearsay though. The author was contacted by Nintendo and offered an agreement to stop working on the project, remove the organization and all related assets he's in control of. Effectively a cease and desist order on a global scale relating to that project. This one is tricky, as usual. Quite why it's happening now, not sure. Alex, I'm going to go to you first on this.
For me, as I kind of said with Yuzu, I don't really actually care of the details. I think just as a principled stance, emulation requires protection and has been legally protected. And the legal protections afforded to emulation, though, do not stop a company with a lot of money from just blindsiding, casual developers who do not have millions of dollars, potentially. If the threat of being sued and having to defend yourself, and you could win, and that's the whole point. The precedent of law says you should probably win, but the amount of money you might spend doing that and years of your life and your wits and all these things make it not worth it. So these people, this being taken down before any sort of suit was issued, actually I think makes perfect sense. I cannot hate this developer who's done that. I would be in a similar situation and I would feel awful too. I just think it's wrong because emulation is the only way games are preserved over time, and piracy is actually the only way games are preserved over time. Unfortunately, given the current state of the way things are sold or not sold, a lot of things are just not sold anymore. A lot of games from the Xbox, PS2, PS3 era are just sitting there and only exist as physical things or as things you can pirate digitally. And the physical things are disappearing. They're becoming, you can buy like a used game, maybe some of them for hundreds of euros or some of them for, a pence, nothing. And I don't think that's a good way to have the market structured. I think these games should be more widely available. And I think that emulation, and yes, at the end of the day, for the most hardcore title that isn't worth it or found anywhere, piracy is actually the only way to keep it in existence. And every single time Nintendo goes against one of these projects, they're doing, active damage to the preservation community. And I think that is bad. It's an extremely bad precedent. And I think they're completely in the wrong here. That's how I feel about this.
Okay. Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's not great. Certainly the thing that's concerning to me most here is that Nintendo is going after emulators that superficially should be within the white lines of the law on this stuff. So maybe there is a bit more of a gray area in terms of emulators that are maybe facilitating piracy of newer releases. And then when you look at maybe the way that Yuzu in particular dealt with games that were upcoming, and or pre-release, but maybe had been leaked, things like that. You know, you don't really know what's going on here, but I still think like it's just very unfortunate that you have this standard being set. Personally, I don't really use Switch emulators, and I really haven't in the past all too much. I think the predominant issue here is game preservation, and it seems like, to me at least, a little bit less of a pressing issue given the existence of Switch 2 and the probable continuation of forwards compatibility with that console line for the foreseeable future. But certainly when you look at the Switch and its software library, I do think that there is some value in Switch emulators, a lot of value, because a lot of games are not running at a great performance level on the Switch hardware. It's like we've seen recently with Echoes of Wisdom, which does not run well at all on Switch hardware. And then, of course, you know, image quality is often not great in those titles as well. But I mean, I'm kind of conflicted because the reality of a decision like this is it just really complicates development moving forward, and you'll still be able to get these emulators. So perhaps that would be an okay situation, at least for a lot of games right now, that you could still download a version of Yuzu or a version of Ryujinx. Maybe there's not active development going on those projects, but it doesn't like stop this dead. It just basically says like the development is probably going to halt to a reasonable degree. Like the emulators that are based on Yuzu that have continued development are not in such a great state at the moment in terms of the development environment there, which is obviously understandable because Nintendo might pull your project fairly easily. But ultimately, like I think that if Nintendo does want to pull these emulator projects, I'd certainly prefer that they didn't. But I'd love to see better backwards compatibility support on the Switch 2. I'd love to see something that boosted CPU clocks. I'd love to see something that gave you a bit more headroom on the GPU, perhaps boosted GPU clocks there quite a bit, because when you are playing those Switch titles on the original Switch, sometimes you are ending up with some of those problems. And if you look at the boosted hardware that you get with modding a cracked Switch, so to speak, you actually end up with a lot of titles that do run it like a locked 60 FPS in the Switch hardware with just a little bit of a boost on that CPU clock and that GPU clock. So, I mean, ultimately, it's not a great situation. I still think the status quo with emulators doesn't change that much because you'll still be able to get a version of Ryujinx, you're still able to get a version of Yuzu, but certainly like what it means for the future of Nintendo and the future of these emulator projects is kind of dire, I think, and that might not be such a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to take a couple of supporter questions here. This one from Inebriated Porcupine. ADF exclamation point. Ryujinx has been taken down by Nintendo. When Yuzu was taken down, Nintendo had a strong case that it was promoting piracy by adding support for Zelda Tears of the Kingdom before its release. In the case of Ryujinx, no reason was given, leading many to speculate this is an anti-emulation move. What is your opinion of this takedown and its impact on future preservation of Nintendo titles? Well, I think Oliver and Alex have just covered the points there pretty saliently. All I can really add to that is that the timing is odd, which may tie into this question from Zephyr. Hi DF team exclamation point. Do you think that the recent takedown of Ryujinx is due to Nintendo's fear that it will be an easy basis of Nintendo Switch 2 emulation? Could we be looking at another GameCube/Wii scenario where the two generations are very similar architecturally? I'm not sure they're similar architecturally, but I do think that a lot of the work that was carried out for emulating Switch 1 may well carry over to emulating Switch 2 because they're going to be using NVIDIA hardware. They're going to be using the NVN API. So it probably would be a bit of a leg up there in order to sort of emulate Switch 2. And at that point, that is quite tricky, right? Because, well, for the same reasons that we've got now, the same games running better on more superior hardware. I mean, that we could be looking at a rerun of that. And I suspect Nintendo just wants to nip it in the bud. What do you think about that, Alex?
I mean, that would be interesting if it were true. I still think it would require a hefty amount of work.
Oh, sure. It's not just going to happen.
Yeah. I think that would be interesting if it were true. I don't know if it has to do anything with that, the timing of the Switch 2 release. I think maybe there's just moments where Nintendo is bullish and like a bully, the confidence is high and they have the wherewithal to do these things and they just kind of do them. Kind of like how everyone was wondering, when will they sue the people who made Pale World? And they decided to do it on the grounds and the basis at a later date than everyone thought they would. So I think that's interesting. I just think it's more of a coincidence than anything. And I don't, I just want to reiterate that I don't see any problem with an emulator coming into existence while a product is still on the market. I think the specter of piracy is just a specter, and I think people who don't buy games don't buy games. I really think that is the truth. I in my life have pirated games. The first ever thing I ever played on GBA was actually through an emulator. I was at a point in my life where I didn't buy games, but then I bought games when I started to have, income and things like that. And I think
does help generally.
Yeah, it usually does help to have money, and also, the market. There's a lot of places where things aren't actually sold. And I think people who don't buy games don't buy games, and getting rid of emulation during the product's lifespan, I don't know, actually think it's going to be affecting the bottom line too much, if that is the argumentation. I actually think it is more just about like the protection of brand imagery, and the punishing of those who go and step on that brand imagery. I don't know if it actually is getting Nintendo a lot of bucks at the end of the day.
Okay. Well, beyond that particular incident, there was also the fact that the YouTube channel Retro Game Core was being targeted with copyright strikes for Nintendo for its content. I haven't followed this one closely, but Oliver, maybe you can get me up to speed here.
Yeah, so my understanding is that Retro Game Core, he does a lot of emulation videos. I've watched his content for quite a while. He covers a lot of retro handhelds in the Android space and the PC space as well. And it seems like he had basically done a couple of videos with some Wii U emulation content in it, and Nintendo took the route of issuing a copyright strike, and they issued 2 copyright strikes. Now, the problem with this scenario is that if you get 3 copyright strikes within a short span, your channel is taken down forever on YouTube. And I have been in this situation before with channels that I've worked for in the past, where we had 2 copyright strikes, we had 2 strikes on our content, and all of a sudden, if you get that 3rd strike, you're totally gone, and you could lose a channel with 1 million subs or something massive like that. So that is an extremely tense situation to be in. It's an extremely unfair situation to be in. I don't really approve of anyone taking the route of taking someone's channel down with copyright strikes. In fact, they pulled this content in such a real blunt force way that actually threatens his channel and possibly his livelihood, I think is a pretty nasty move.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, once again, though, but where's the line drawn at that point? Because you're just presenting something on YouTube that is just a recording of an emulator. I don't even know what does the copyright say there that makes it different from people talking about a new Switch game trailer and then not having that demonetized. It's I don't know what the legal argument is there. The whole thing is it's not a legal argument because it's just arbitrated by YouTube, and usually very poorly. So I don't know how to think about it other than that I like Oliver. I think it's actually pretty bad, and I feel it makes our coverage actually always think a little awkward, because there's been times where I've thought it'd be interesting to actually mention some sort of emulation regarding some things. We've done it before with RPCS3. John's made entire videos about that. Right? Mm-hmm. And that's an amazing thing. And also with switch overclocking,
we've done some stuff on that.
Yeah, right. All these things,
we did it with Crisis.
Right. But what happens if you do that and then it gets you a copyright strike because Nintendo, by its whim in that week, doesn't feel comfortable with you talking about something that is not as part of their TOS, right?
Yeah, I mean, YouTube's always had a bit of a bizarre relationship with YouTube, to the extent that they seem to think that if this is just my read on the situation, that if you have footage of their games within your content, they kind of own it, which is, an interesting take. And possibly there could be some legal precedent behind it at some level, who knows. But it's just bad behavior. It's just poor behavior. It's heavy-handed behavior. And it basically brings about a chilling effect that, it's almost as if it's been designed to send a message. And I'm extremely uncomfortable with that. I think in all of these situations, both in the emulator side of things and also in this particular case of Nintendo effectively claiming ownership of content, at some point a line will be drawn and there will be a further legal case. The question is really how that's going to go. It does seem to be the case that Nintendo isn't particularly happy with the legal precedents and is kind of working around them, so to speak. I mean, there are ways and means by exerting legal force without ever actually setting foot in a courtroom, which is, what's happening with the Ryujinx emulator. With the emulating footage stuff, I'm just totally baffled by it, to be honest. Why? In what way does this harm Nintendo? The platform's dead. It's been dead since 2013? Mm-hmm. It's just totally bizarre. In that case, you would expect at least YouTube to have some kind of role to play in arbitrating this and actually figuring out a best use policy to ensure it doesn't happen again. Because it just seems to be like Wild West almost. Wild West, totally off the cuff decision making. That can have a massive effect on creators, and for no reason. It's just utterly bizarre. Mm-hmm. Do we have anything more to add on this before we move on? It's all a bit depressing.
The only thing I'd add is that I did fact check myself in real time here, and the video, the second strike was against a video centering on the Wii U. The first video that was taken down in that case was actually a video that was focusing on a tool that allowed you to interface with Switch cartridges on PC. So that video was maybe a little bit more contentious, but the second video was just a Wii U emulation video, it seems.
If you're going to be connecting cartridges to PCs, there is going to be a certain degree of decryption involved. Yeah. And things get a bit more murky on that front. And it really depends on the tools and how they work. I mean, that's just really tricky. But Wii U, come on. Okay, let's move on to the next news topic. Okay then, so generally speaking, a game comes in for review. You review the game. We're typically given like a week to review the game. And, that's okay. Could do with more time. Until Dawn, the remaster, has arrived on PlayStation 5 and PC. And this one is somewhat different in that the game arrived 24 hours before launch day. Typically, that sends out the message that the game isn't particularly great because, whoever supplies that review code seemingly doesn't want reviews ready for launch. Right. Now, Oliver, you've taken a look at the PlayStation 5 version of Until Dawn. You've stacked it up against the PlayStation 4 version,
yes,
running under back compat on PlayStation 5. And let's just say that things are a bit problematic, right?
Yes, let me start with the good stuff. Let me start with the good stuff, to be fair to them. Because there is some good stuff here. So the first surprise to me is that the game has basically been completely redone, or largely redone, more or less. Especially with different scenes in the opening of the game. The first 20 minutes plays out very, very differently. It's expanded quite a bit. It has totally different cinematic direction across all the scenes. You take control of the characters at different times. The gameplay is tweaked. So like in the 2015 version, there are like these long, uninteractive QTE sequences, very David Cage-esque, I'd say, that now you actually play through. You can actually propel a character through the environment and actually, get some modicum of gameplay there. And the camera, they've changed the camera system in the game from this kind of like loosely tracked camera and also Resident Evil style camera system from that first game that focused on fixed and kind of these semi-fixed camera angles to a regular third-person right stick camera, which is perfectly fine. It actually feels pretty good, I'd say, on the controller for the most part, but the character movement is still a little bit sluggish, so you don't get that kind of like tight responsiveness that I think you kind of tend to want when you have full camera control over a character, like that really snappy movement. But of course, this is a slower paced game, and it's kind of like, a little bit awkward, but it doesn't feel too bad. It's pretty all right there. And there have also been some gameplay changes. Like I only played like the first 30-40 minutes of the game, but there are some mini games that are definitely better implemented here. Like there's a little shooting mini game, and the camera direction and the control and how that scene plays out, it's more natural in PS5 in the new version. In terms of the visual evolution from the first game, I think it actually looks a lot better in the kind of core visuals of the game in that respect. The character rendering has taken a pretty huge step forward in terms of a detail level, in terms of the fidelity of skin rendering. The first game looked pretty great for its time, looking back, but it was an early PS4 title. Does not distinguish itself too amazingly today, I would say. The one exception to that, I think, that still holds up really well is these kind of interstitial scenes with Peter Stormare giving you this really rousing performance, where you get the sense they really went all out with the technology. And I can imagine, probably based on what I'm seeing there, maybe they had a different process for the facial capture, because those scenes are more limited in scope, and the facial rendering is like really, really nice in that content. And here it looks a lot better there, but you tend to see like, okay, they're drawing very heavily from this original content, and they're basically displaying that with higher fidelity assets there. The environments also seem to have been totally remodeled. There's nice little touches like the formable tessellated snow, I think. And the lighting in the remake is often very different. You get much grayer shadows, very different color tone. It's going for something a little bit less stark. That original game, it's very contrasty. You get a very dark, deep black presentation. You get very bright highlights, and it has a cool color tone. In this title, it's more of a warm color tone, and they're going for more of that kind of like gradated look with grayer blacks. Tech-wise, it is kind of interesting. I think there are some things you can rule out pretty easily. It is Unreal Engine 5 here. It's not using a lot of those headline features, so I did not spot a good reflections fallback for Lumen. I don't think they're using Lumen reflections. VSMs are pretty plainly absent. There are some high-resolution shadows, but they're very clear shadow cascades. I don't think the game is using Lumen GI, or if it is, it's not very good, because I wasn't seeing a lot of a great showing for indirect lighting here. There was a lot of places where the indirect lighting, like underneath this bridge overpass here, where the indirect lighting is just kind of failing, where you're getting like this really dark lighting presentation where you should be getting a little bit more of that visible kind of bounce through the scene. And there's no like Lumen GI noise. But okay, so that's the first part of it, which is basically talking about the underlying visuals. Now let's move on to some of the technical problems. So the pre-rendered cutscenes appear to play back with very severe frame pacing or frame ordering issues. Now, most of the cutscenes are real-time, but there are a few of the pre-rendered cutscenes where they're kind of going through an environment a little bit more quickly, showing you a little bit more varied content, and it just looks absolutely horrendous. It just looks horrible. The game has some of the ugliest film grain I've ever seen. It's updating at like 10 to 15 hertz. And it has these awful patterns that look so coarse. It's just an absolute eyesore. It's enabled by default. It looks horrible. And it has kind of different brightness across the frame, sort of, and it has this kind of weird pattern to it. So it's super distracting. It does not look like film that you'd get out of like a scan from a film camera. It does not look like that at all. I usually play with film grain on unless I'm playing for capture purposes, but this look pretty horrible. Image quality is also not great, I would say, but actually the internal res, when I counted it out, it's like 1440p-ish, 1728p-ish. It's coming out at pretty good numbers there. But there's so much aliasing in the image, especially on the fur and the hair and just on high contrast edges in general. It's not great. And the image is kind of breaking up every time there's motion on screen. It does not look great. There are also big performance issues in the 3D content. So not just the pre-rendered content, but the 3D content. This took the form of pretty horrible frame pacing issues in some of the content that I looked at, that I did actually performance analysis on. It could be the case that it gets a little bit worse later on in the game. I only really captured a small portion of it for this analysis, but I was feeling those inconsistencies all over the place. And this has no performance mode either. It's just 30 FPS. So that's kind of the list of initial issues and kind of the initial list of strengths that I saw in the footage, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this one, because it's certainly an interesting game, and the fact that we were sampled it so late, I kind of suspect there's probably a reason for that we're seeing here.
I'm curious what you make of this, Alex. I'm just sort of a bit baffled as to why this thing exists in the first place.
Yeah, it's totally weird. I mean, especially because you're transplanting all this work to a different engine, apparently. It seems like so much time. And nowadays, I doubt you're going to be reusing the initial assets if you were making a sequel, because you would want to rescan in all these characters and people and actors and actresses if they were to show up in the sequel again, with the modern technology that you're not, fixing someone's mistakes from back then at like low res. So I find it extremely strange. I do find the also lack of advertisement, and it's strange there's a lot of that strangeness here. But I think Alvaro points at a really big failing. I think if you're going to have a 30 FPS cap in a title that is basically a movie in a lot of ways, you have to do it right. And it not being right here to me is just a really big failing, because I think everyone's eyes can see this. I just don't know if they can put their finger on it and point at the technical reason for it. And as a result of that, I think I would not recommend, like, if a game has, especially on PS5, where you cannot save it with VRR at 30 hertz per default, I don't think that's great. And I have yet to look at the PC version. I would imagine, since it's Unreal, it probably has other failings, but I haven't seen it. So I can't really comment. But at the moment, I would say PS5 seems pretty weird, bad place to be in, actually.
Yeah, 30 FPS. I mean, if you're only going to have one singular performance mode and it's 30 FPS, then surely get your 30 FPS vein basic done correctly. It's not difficult. Sony has system modes to do it, system libraries that just do the job for you. So it is just a touch bizarre. Also bizarre, of course, is the fact that you can run the original PlayStation 4 game on PlayStation 5 and it's kind of 50 to 60 FPS region, which is essentially what you looked at as well, Oliver.
Yes, I mean, that original game, a lot of content, it does run at 60 FPS. It is 1080p 60 there because it never got a PS4 Pro enhancement. It was released in 2015, obviously, so it did not get that support by default, basically. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because you go back to that game and it does look pretty good still. I think there are some issues that could probably be cleaned up pretty easily. Like there's a lot of shadow aliasing, right? But of course, increased shadow resolution, shadow map resolution, that goes away. You could certainly improve like level of detail scaling, maybe play with the lighting a little bit. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's outside of scope, but it could be within scope. Maybe work on that, sell it for $20 or $30. Seems reasonable. Get it like 1440p 60, 4K 30. That seems like not too difficult. It's running on Decima, obviously. You know, I don't think you'd probably port it to a new version of Decima, but I don't think it'd be that hard to get running on PS5 in a decent form. Indeed, it's already running on PS5 in a decent form in this backwards compatible version, but just bumping up a couple of those settings would probably do it. And I'm just kind of befuddled because, like, you look at these Sony remakes or remasters, as they call it, with the Horizon title, but that's kind of a little bit of a remake in its own terms. Of these last-gen games, which is sort of weird. Like, what's this fascination with taking games that already look good and run pretty well on current generation hardware and remastering them or remaking them in a situation where maybe a lighter touch would be appropriate, or even with some titles, like, you don't really need to do too much to them, like The Last of Us Part 2, which got a remastered version on PS5. That was already running pretty great with the PS4 code on PS5, and the PS5 code did not see too many improvements. Likewise with Ghost of Tsushima, right? Some titles like that. And now we have Horizon, and now this, and then we also had The Last of Us Part 1, which was maybe a somewhat more worthwhile remastering effort, remaking effort, but still, that was like a little bit out of left field as well. So I do wonder about this. Like, clearly there is a lot of effort that's gone into this title, clearly a lot of time, a lot of money, I'm sure. It does look pretty good relative to the original in a lot of respects, like that underlying artwork, the underlying lighting. I think it is a stronger effort in all those areas. I think it does compare favorably. But it's like these weird technical issues that are failing it. The weird, like the poor anti-aliasing quality, the poor frame pacing, the miserable pre-rendered cutscenes, like that's just not shippable and remotely. It just looks absolutely horrible. I mean, I thought my TV was broken, sort of. It was that bad. And yeah, that original game could use some touch-ups for sure. But like, you think about the time investment that would be required to bring that original game up to kind of a little bit more contemporary standards, maybe bump a couple things up, maybe even remodel the characters. I don't know. You could probably go pretty all out with it and still end up with a lower budget than this, right? So
on like the same tech base, right? It's so weird to transplant the engine. I have no idea what that's about.
I just get the idea that maybe, just maybe, the bean counters have actually figured out that these projects are worthwhile. And then you have the option of possibly thinking, well, you know, if we actually get good sales results from this, maybe there is a route forward with a sequel. And I'd imagine in terms of the core work that the developers have in making the remaster, there's going to be a huge amount of material available that can be suitably embellished, probably at a much lower budget level than doing something new. I think that's pretty much the only reason why this would happen. But it does seem to be a particularly weird thing that's only really happening this generation. And it's kind of odd, isn't it? Oliver, do you think that I mean, it looks as though there's a solid foundation here at least, but just a lot of technical issues that should have been caught much earlier in development, right? I mean, stuff like the FMV playback, that's a bug. It should be fixed. The frame pacing issue, that can be fixed. They could get Illusion in to do it if they wanted to, but it is just using the Sony system library, unless there's some reason why that isn't viable for some reason. But we have historically seen issues with Unreal and 30 FPS caps, and some of the other issues that you've talked about. They don't seem to be remarkably difficult to achieve, to fix, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, the underlying work they've done here in terms of improving that visual presentation, improving the character models, even like reworking the whole first 20 minutes of the game to have totally different pacing, new cutscene sequences, like they really redid it from scratch there. And from what I understand, there are like lots of changes deeper into the game, possibly, like with, I've heard stuff about new endings and possibly indeed teeing up that sequel that you suggested, Rich, they might be working on there. And I know that this is one of those kind of famous Sony Interactive Entertainment like multimedia projects now, where they have like a film in the works. They have that original game. They have, it's the whole shebang here. So you kind of expect like this could be the first part of a bit of a salvo of projects. But in that case, I do think you kind of want this to be a little bit more polished than what they've achieved so far. And I certainly hope they can bring it up that level of polish. But it's just unfortunate because, like, especially with a remastering effort or a remake effort, you kind of expect it to be a little bit easier to kind of nail some of those elements and have it working pretty well out of the gate. Again, with performance improvements, maybe even over that original code, ideally. But obviously that's not the case here. So, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the underlying work is very, very strong work, but also there are some, like, weird issues around the edges that could probably be cleaned up. But, well, I guess we'll have to see on that one.
I guess it is worth saying that the only reason you can play that 60 FPS experience on PS5 is because the original was running unlocked. And if we look back to that actual original release, it actually ran shockingly poorly.
Yeah, it's like in the 20s, wasn't it? Pretty often?
It wasn't great. Yeah. So, that's basically, just the brute force power of backwards compatibility that's producing these comparisons here. I think it's got to be patched. They need to take a good hard look at all of the issues being raised here and just get it into shape. I just don't quite understand how it's shipped like that. Those cinematics and the playback there is unbelievable. It's like, who saw that? Who didn't see that? It's just baffling. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so Unreal Fest 2024, a showcase for new epic technology. And we got to see a new technology called MegaLights, which looks quite intriguing. Now, Alex,
sure,
you've got to talk us through this one because it's certainly quite impactful, right?
Mm-hmm. So the what MegaLights is trying to solve is the fact that in rasterized graphics, you can have a lot of lights, but the conceit is shadowing them, making them shadowed lights is very expensive because you have to render the entire scene from the light's perspective to get the shadow map. And there's just a hard limit on performance for that. If you think about it, it'd be like if you have hundreds of shadow casting lights, that means hundreds of separate rendering cameras throughout the world, not rendering textures and things like that, but they're rendering something from the perspective of that shadow casting light, and that doesn't scale up at all. So ray tracing as a competitor technology would make that cheaper because you're not having to re-render the whole scene. You're just kind of bouncing a ray around the scene to see whether or not it sees a light or not. And the issue with that, with ray tracing, is that you have to send out a lot of rays. So how do you know where to see whether or not one pixel is in shadow or not? You have to send out a lot of rays. So there's been variety of ray tracing technologies that have come up to sample lights in a better way. One of them that we've talked a lot about on the channel before is Reester, which NVIDIA terms as RTXDI, and we've seen in a number of titles on PC. We've covered it most recently in Star Wars Outlaws, where you can see in that game it makes it so every single light in the scene is shadow casting, and it also adds in new light sources altogether, new area light sources, for example. That's the grounds of things. Unreal Engine 5 does not support RTXDI or Reester by default. And what this video shows that they brought out originally, we can talk about also the whole stream quality thing. They showed it off on this 1080p stream over YouTube, 60 FPS stream. And what it shows is the game running on PlayStation 5 at some unknown resolution and frame rate we'll talk about later, where they go through a scene and they show off now through using something called MegaLights. They can have it so that they don't say every single light, but they say basically like thousands of lights in a scene can now be considered shadow casting. And if they go through this interesting trailer, you'll see through most of the scene, like in the beginning of it, they're showing off particular types of lights, area lights, which are hard to get shadows from because light isn't emanating from a point there, but it's emanating from an entire surface. So the area, usually the shadows from that are very diffuse and they have a shape to them that is unique. Those are hard to render and actually impossible to render with rasterization. But later on the trailer, they go to this like market area and they show that a bunch of lights on, and it kind of looks like, I would say, a current generation game at that moment. But then they switch on MegaLights, which changes the entire rendering path for forward direct lighting, and you get a bunch of shadows in the environment that weren't there before. And it's very interesting because it's actually a huge difference, I would say, in like side-by-side visual quality. And they're showing it running on a PlayStation 5. And technologies like Reester are very expensive to render. They just have like a flat cost that is high, in spite of being way faster than the rasterization alternative. So Epic here is doing something very bespoke in particular for what to get it to run on PlayStation 5, and I think there's a lot I can say about that actually. But we kind of got a sense about how it's rendering on PlayStation 5. I think when they sent us a higher quality version of that feed, that 1080p 60 feed, was actually like super high quality. But then they also released like a 30-second sizzle reel of a recording running also what appears to be on PlayStation 5. That is also 60 FPS. And you get to see some more of the limitations I would see there than that initial stream, where the stream was like really blocky and smudgy and not very good quality at all. But then when it's actually at like a higher output quality, you can see where the shortcuts are coming in. And I think, Rich, you noticed some things in there, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. It was, how do you describe it? There's certain things in there that are reminiscent to me of what we saw in like the Cyberpunk 2077 path tracing.
Mm-hmm.
Typically accumulation across frames. The lighting seemed to transition quite slowly, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of very sort of typical of Reester. Also, it's kind of like a sort of grainy effect to it.
Yeah.
So you can see the trades that are being made, and I think you can understand that there's, it's still experimental. Frame rate also, I think you pointed out that it's kind of in a weird 30 to 35 FPS no man's land generally.
Weird decision for it to be showcased that way, but yeah, it is for some reason.
Yeah, but what can you say? The visual impact is astonishing, and as first iteration of this work, it's highly promising.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do get some details after the fact. I asked behind the scenes as well, as there's a post by Andrew Lordson on Beyond 3D when he was asked about it. It is not using Reester directly, but it is using a way of sampling lights that is going to be adjacent to it, to similar research there. It's probably just cheaper. Another thing that we know from other investigations is that the default setting, and this is probably actually different even on PlayStation 5, is that it's sending rays at half resolution of internal resolution. That's something that Reister doesn't do, for example. NVIDIA always wants those kind of things done at full res, just to fit in better with their denoisers. Another thing that was interesting to see from the trailer as well too is that I did count it. It is in many parts just 1080p internal resolution. I think that is obvious in kind of like the overall like pixel perfectness of the trailer. But as they get towards the end of it, when the main character walks in this hallway, this like elevator that kind of ascends, I think at the end, and a lot of lights turn on and this like circular, I don't know, atrium, I don't know what to even call it. You can see that as the lights turn on at the very end of it, there's a lot of things like Rich was talking about, like light lag and the denoiser failing. So you see a lot of like larger scale noise. It like blows up the noise actually to be like large. One thing you can see is that as all the lights turn on, if you look at the floor, there's these hanging kind of spherical lights. And from a lot of them, I think it's like the first maybe 4 or 5 or 6 lights on left or right side, you can actually see there's a specular reflection beneath them. But from the ones beyond that, you cannot see the specular reflection beneath them. And the reasons for that might be that there's some sort of, due to the way lights are sampled, that there's a hard cutoff, like within like a certain distance from the camera, or the noise is too high from those lights in the distance so that the denoiser is actually killing the specularity from them. And the interesting part about this is them showing it on PS5, but they also sent us screenshots of what the PC version of MegaLights looks like. And in that scene, you can see actually that there's no such limitation for the lights in the distance on the floor. You can see the specular lights sheen from all the lights in the room. So they are showing it off in an interesting, optimized form on PlayStation 5 there. I guess one thing I'm curious about this, and I would ask this into the planar discussion here, is this something that will actually ship in games at the promised levels that Epic says it will? Maybe. I know it's experimental right now, but kind of go to the Matrix demo that we saw years back. And honestly, I know games take a long time to develop, but hardware lumen is pretty much a no-show on console. And that demo was all about hardware lumen, right? The promises at the beginning of the generation that UE5 games would also be 60 FPS in some capacity, I feel like hasn't been borne out in a good way. I don't think other than Fortnite or
Jusant.
Yep.
Jusant, yeah, which we can all talk about why those are 60 FPS experiences. That's pretty obvious. But yeah, like, what do you guys think about this? Like, what's your opinion, Oliver?
I thought it was really a stunning demo. I think it's a lot like RTX Ti, but like you said, I mean, the performance level is high enough for console use, which opens up a lot of cases that weren't possible before, because ultimately you don't really want to build a game around requiring this kind of high level of RT fidelity everywhere to look good, right? Because you're going to have to ship that on console. But I think one possible problem here, and just kind of like looking at it, maybe Alex, you could comment on this, but it kind of does seem like you'd maybe need to build a game around this a little bit, because like when you start to look at the level of quality that you need for like the BVH to do shadows, like all this direct lighting, all these shadows, you kind of can't get away with the same simplifications and the same compromises you'd use for like GI, let's say, or maybe for reflections where you're overlaying a lot of that screen space information. You don't need the highest quality assets there. I think that's maybe a constraint that you need to have in mind to build a game around. And I do kind of wonder, like, you have this, obviously it's an experimental feature, but like you look at this and you think, okay, well, already it's like 1080p, 30, not great image quality on console in kind of a more, you know, carefully crafted environment here. To actually get that in a full shipping game where you're actually building it around this kind of feature, maybe that's not something that we're going to see too often in this generation. Right. Personally, I'm kind of more invested. Like, I think MegaLights is a really cool demo. I think it looks amazing, but I'm personally like more interested in what Epic is talking about with hardware lumen optimizations on console to hit 60 FPS. Like, that to me is more exciting. Could potentially be applied to projects that are in development, not just projects that might start development now that are built around certain lighting technologies, at least from what I can tell, right? And that could possibly give you a big fidelity boost to a project that might get released in like 2026 or something, possibly, right? That is in progress today. They're using software lumen. They're not happy with the performance, or they're not happy with the visual fidelity there, but they need it for the performance. Now all of a sudden they can adopt hardware lumen at maybe 30 FPS or maybe even 60 FPS and get a really good result on the consoles. So that's really what I'm more invested in from this Unreal Showcase. But for sure, you look at this and it's like, wow, this is like insane. It's running on a console. It looks outrageous, but it's also like, this is kind of a demo, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. I think this is more an interesting future proof of concept for something that will be shipping in like PS6 games, more or less, due to just the things that you mentioned, the lack of image quality there, the fact that you need to build a game around it. One very important thing to talk about this demo is that they don't showcase the kind of killer scenario. And that's the reason why NVIDIA has ray reconstruction, is where they just show like a light and like moving characters, and a light moves and the character moves at the same time. Denoisers are going to go, they're probably going to do that really badly, because there's just like a fight to keep things good looking, and then as soon as they start moving, all the heuristics that say let's try and make this pixel look good are thrown out the window, and you get all this either noise or extreme light lag and ghosting. And that's why NVIDIA has ray reconstruction, and that's something that enables RTX DI to actually work really well, I would say, in modern games. It's a big boost towards its image quality, and that wouldn't be available here, and I think it could break a lot of scenes, presuming they don't have some sort of magical breakthrough in denoising in the next 2 years or something like that. So yeah, there's that. I am also of your opinion that just to say it, on the sidelines in different parts of this presentation and this Unreal Fest, they describe the fact they are optimizing hardware lumen to better focus on, when they say getting up to 60 hertz, what they're talking really about is actually getting that like CPU performance up, and some of the GPU performance as well there too. But really, CPU performance in UE5 with hardware lumen isn't the greatest. And there's a lot of optimizations going on there to bring it up, which then could enable things like better performance overall for using hardware lumen, as well as enabling the concept that you can maybe target 60 hertz on console with hardware lumen. To the point where now UE 5.5 will default when you start it up to using the hardware lumen path, which is something it didn't do before. You had to enable it separately in the settings, and no one did that. That's why almost every game ships with software lumen. So there's that. I think this is an interesting proof of concept demo, but it obviously, there's enough corner cutting in there that I think when you look at it, it's hard to imagine a game being designed around it at the moment. So I would say this is really cool future tech, and I'm really excited to see what it means on next gen hardware at the moment, more so than current gen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with that. And also just generally, it's, in terms of the current sort of roadmap of Unreal Engine 5, all eyes are on the Coalition.
Yes, right.
Gears E-Day to see just, what the best in the business can do with this technology. And I think we've all got very, very high expectations there. Okay, with that, let's move on. Okay, so it's been a point of contention for some time now that Xbox doesn't seem to be getting Final Fantasy games. And that seems to be changing in the wake of messaging post-Tokyo Game Show. And, it's began with the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters. They are now available on Xbox. But Final Fantasy 16 producer Yoshida-san has said that Final Fantasy 16 is coming, or seemingly they want it to come, to Xbox consoles. We've got this interesting quote here, which I can't quite get my head around. It seems to be a little bit on the fence, but Let's listen to the quote. Of course, we did announce the PC version of the game, so looking towards the Xbox version, we do want to release it on Xbox. But when it comes to the specifics, such as when the game would be available and such, we're not in a position to share anything. But of course, But of course, I want to say it's not as if there's zero hope. And we very much do want to achieve that. So players should not give up in terms of their hopes. And this is put into context of the idea that Square Enix is likely to move more towards a multi-platform strategy because, well, their legendary sales expectations, which are never met, does suggest that some kind of pivot is required there. I don't know what to make of this one, Oliver, because it does kind of seem in the wake of a somewhat tepid reaction to the PC version that this is all kind of too little too late. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the quote is certainly very interesting. I think it's arguably a bit less committal than they had for the PC version, which they kind of said it's coming, but don't wait. Don't hold your breath for it. And of course it ended up arriving.
There's a lot of talk about hope here. I mean, I hope I win the lottery, but it's not going to happen.
Right.
Maybe there's some licensing issue. You never know. I mean, obviously this is a Sony exclusive, was a Sony exclusive until they launched it on PC. There could be some issues there. I'm not privy to that, obviously. But it could be well the case they have some issues there. Or it could be just the case it's not improved internally, or they're just in an early state of development on it. But I don't know. I mean, I think that if they do get to continue working with the code base here, they should probably consider a PS5 Pro upgrade as well. That's my insight into this one, because the game has not the greatest image quality on PS5 as it stands. And something like PSSR, could clean that up quite a bit. Also, if they do ship it on Xbox, I think like getting Series S looking decent probably does require some more creative solutions. Like on PS5, you can kind of brute force it. But on Series S, maybe you're talking about like 540p internal, 720p. If they're bringing over all that tech, all that great shadowing tech, all that great lighting from the PS5 release, maybe something like FSR2 would help. Certainly if you look at the PC version, you do have those upsampling technologies there. Maybe that helps you, but I don't know. I kind of think it's maybe worth teeing off a bit. I don't know if Alex, you have any thoughts on this, but I know that in reaction to our coverage, there was some upset over how heavy the game is on PC. And I don't disagree with that. It's definitely a heavy game. And certainly if we did see it on Xbox, I think we'd see quite a lot of evidence of that on Series S. But it's also a very good looking one. And I personally would always prefer a game that looks a little bit better at a lower resolution, is a bit more sophisticated than a really, really high resolution, like 4K 120 game. Like this game might have looked like if it had been continued to be developed on the PS4 as the base system instead of moving over to PS5 as they did in mid-development there. If they did bring it over to Xbox, I think that would just be a really good chance for them to actually go back, change some things, maybe patch that PS5 version, and kind of correct a couple of those things, because like that Intel TAA combination with FSR1 is just not a super flattering combination, and not just in terms of the overall sharpness and detail resolved in that final image, but also just in terms of the aliasing presentation. Like it has quite a lot of aliasing in it. It does not look amazing on PC. On the PC version, you get like DLAA, and it's like a world apart basically. So, but yeah, that'd be a difficult thing for them to navigate unless they were to bring in possibly some of those technologies in from the PC.
I've got a quick thing to say about image quality there, Oliver. I just want to say that it's not as if there's zero hope, and we very much do hope that they achieve that. So players should not give up in terms of their hopes.
Just as to talk about the quote, I do think it is not the best form to imply a game will be coming out based upon, emotional, like this like actually not completely non-committal. Like why not say we want to bring it to Xbox, we will do everything to bring it to Xbox, like especially in light of their trying to pivot more towards multi-platform because they are not meeting sales expectations by sticking only to Sony, and then the breadcrumbs PC version however long after the fact. I think it's just I also think too little too late. Like Rich is saying, like this game, if it does come out on Xbox, is going to be maybe 2 years late at that point. And Xbox players who have things like a new Game Pass game coming out or a new their own first party title coming out at that point, you have a limited budget. And it's not like this thing is getting Super Bowl commercials anymore. So do you even know it's coming out? Do you even care it's coming out? Like, I think this, like, we release something after the fact is not, it's almost like not enough to make people excited enough again to buy it again. I know that on PC, like my back catalog is ridiculous. Like just a new game, an RPG. Wow. Yeah. So I would vastly prefer the other situation where they take a little bit more time in development and they do multi-platform releases much closer to each other. It doesn't need to be day and date, in my humble opinion. But I think just having them a lot closer so they can synergize in regards to people's excitement levels, as well as hopefully technologically. There's some synergy there. Like if you target a platform, like a higher end platform, then you maybe have sometimes better scaling. And like, cause you have like a stratified grouping of things that one, like better CPUs, less memory. And then you can maybe build in some of those optimizations from like targeting a Series S version back into the main code, right? Like we kind of saw that with Baldur's Gate 3, where the push to get it running on Xbox actually had a pretty significant effect on performance in the PC version after the fact. And I kind of liked that backwards flow. And I would like to see that actually with something like Final Fantasy, where them bringing it over to PC, it I think showcased some of the limitations of the technology to a certain degree, like the sometimes completely absurd levels of GPU limitedness. Like I'm fine with the game being very heavy if it looks good, but the roller coaster of GPU usage was, I think, telltale sign of a game that had like trouble budgeting itself during development. And it's because it's not like, more flat scene to scene, but rather within a scene itself, you could see like 100 doubling of GPU usage just because one effect came on screen. And usually that's like not a good optimization strategy. So yeah, I would like to see them do it closer multi-platform releases and not give people hopes, but give people firm commitments, actually.
I mean, I've just been thinking about this whole idea of, game A arriving on platform B and then it arrives on platform C like a year or 2 years later. I just don't think it's a recipe for success. And I'm looking at what Microsoft has done with Indiana Jones. And there's a very small window of exclusivity between Xbox and PlayStation. I think they've thought it through, and I think they've come to the conclusion that if they actually, held it back for a long period of time, they would make far less money. I mean, it's just basic economics, and I think it's probably the route forward there. Final Fantasy 16, I mean, I'm just concerned it's going to be just way too late. And the competition for eyeballs at the moment, the competition for gameplay time is just so intense that, waiting a couple of years just isn't really going to cut the mustard. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so we got a report from Jason Schreier here, who has said on a recent Spawn Wave podcast that the next major release from Guerrilla Games is going to be a Horizon game, which is great, but it's going to be Horizon Online, not whatever the third single-player game looks like. That's a quote from Schreier there. So by extension, then, it looks as though the lion's share of Guerrilla's resources has been diverted to this multiplayer effort, and the actual sort of end of the trilogy, assuming it is a trilogy, is going to be like years away. Oliver, you've been following this one. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, I don't know, just like my first reaction is that this seems kind of crazy to me, but we have Horizon, we have Horizon 2, we have Horizon Lego Adventures, we have Horizon 1 Remastered, we have a PS5 Pro patch for Horizon 2, and we also had PS5 back compat enhancements for Horizon 1, plus a Horizon MMO potentially in the works. And all of that work in establishing this franchise, and in particular establishing the story of that first and second game, and then not moving immediately on to a Horizon 3, just seems like kind of a waste to me, possibly. Because you're pummeling people with Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 game content, presumably in anticipation of a sequel, and then that sequel doesn't materialize for a while, right? It might be the better part of a half a decade or something until we see the title based off of what's being suggested here. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know, Horizon Online could be integrated in a way that makes more sense. I mean, certainly when you hear about the NCSoft MMO that's allegedly in development as well, it does make more sense. Like as an MMO, it's like an open world game. You have all these cities, you have these quest givers. You could probably adapt the game's combat for tap targeting. You could do lots of different things with it. That makes more sense to me. But I have to presume they have some really compelling gameplay concept. But I do worry maybe this is just another one of those Sony Live Service games that is headed to the graveyard a little bit, and this is not not a great outcome here. But I don't know. I mean, I guess we're going to have to see that game actually what it looks like, but I'm not really seeing a really compelling multiplayer gameplay concept within the kind of Horizon style of title, really.
Alex?
Well, I mean, if you look at, so Concord is them trying to do Destiny Overwatch, even though they own Destiny. This could be their take on survival crafting, which Sony doesn't have a survival crafting game, to my knowledge.
That's sort of what like The Last of Us Factions was about a little bit.
Was it supposed to be that? Oh, wow. Well, I mean, maybe there's a way there that fits in with the tone of the series. I don't know if that's why people go to the series, though. I don't think that is necessarily the angle why people like it. I think the RPG mechanics are not the strongest aspect of Horizon. And like the crafting aspects are not the strongest aspect of the Horizon games. I think people really are attracted to these games for other reasons, perhaps. I also think it's a bit just too much. There is too much of a good thing. And like, if you're just constantly reiterating on the same universe, there is a fatigue that can occur in terms of audience wanting to see something else, and also maybe preferring to see these game mechanics in a different environment. Like, for example, whatever this ends up being, why did it need to be a Horizon game other than for brand recognition purposes is another thing. It doesn't interest me based on that. And I also, why push another Horizon game when you could use those resources to push a different game in a new universe, excite people for something new, and then also have Horizon's sequel come out in the future as well too. Half-Life 2, ever since that came out, there's been a lot of things that Valve has done as well, and they haven't made Half-Life 3, but they've also done those things really well. And then when Half-Life 3 comes, it's going to be, all people are going to be all the more excited for it. Same thing on a smaller scale could apply to Horizon, where they do something else in the meantime, and they let the technology churn and the gameplay ideas churn for a Horizon sequel that really makes people very excited. So yeah, I don't know what this is about. Doesn't excite me at all. Makes me a little sad, actually.
I think we need to see the game. Ultimately, we have no idea really what we're talking about here. All I can really say is that Guerrilla know what they're doing. And, if you think about the long gestation period of the original Horizon itself, it was like 5 or 6 years. That it was a gigantic project for them. They must have like a whole sort of universe of ideas generated across that time period. I do think that there is ways and means in which you can take the existing technology, enhance it, and add gameplay mechanics that would work in a multiplayer sense. Are we even aware of whether it's like a sort of Destiny game or like an MMO? Has there been any indication at all?
Well, there is an MMO allegedly, or quite close to confirmed, in development at another studio at NCSoft. So I'd presume this is something that's fairly different from an MMO. Otherwise, you'd have some overlap there. But we don't know if it's a co-op experience, if it's competitive, how close it is to that original Horizon. Maybe it's an arena shooter. Maybe it's a Counter-Strike.
Oh, no.
You don't know. Right.
Okay, so maybe there has been sort of some games as a service direction from above, which means that this is what we're getting. But I still think that Guerrilla ultimately know what they're doing, and there must be a reason for this game to exist. I do think they probably have the clout to have said, to have pushed back if it was something that they didn't want to do. So I think we have to give them the time. We have to see the game. I do think it is unfortunate, though, if it means that the ongoing storylines are basically put on hold in favour of this thing. That would be a bit sad from my perspective. We got anything more to add to this before we move on?
Well, the only thing I would say here is that basically when you look at like some other titles that have gone from a little bit of this kind of like really ordinal sequel approach that then something a little bit more off the wall, like kind of with Wolfenstein 2 to Wolfenstein Youngblood. There you have a bit of a different approach. There you have a co-op approach, but it's not totally different. And I kind of wonder here if they could maybe continue that Horizon 2 story a little bit, involve some of the same characters, involve some of the same plot lines, possibly, maybe not a direct sequel in the same way that our Horizon 3 would be, but kind of keep that going a little bit, keep that narrative thrust going to some degree in this title. Again, depending on how it's formatted, because we've seen from Concord that possibly doing a, play-by-play narrative of the week experience is not going to connect with players so well. But if they could find some way to do that in a title that is not so different from that original Horizon concept, that Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 concept, maybe they could do something that kind of satisfies both audiences. That's all I would say here, is that, again, because we don't know. So they could very well be doing something that actually is going to satiate those two groups of people, the people who are interested in a multiplayer title, the people who want a new Horizon title. You never know. And like you said, Rich, I mean, it's Guerrilla. I'm sure they have good reasons for approaching this project and for doing what they're doing at the moment. So we just have to see what they'll deliver. But it certainly is a bit curious, I'd say, if nothing else. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's move on. Okay, so recently Sony Santa Monica released the PC version of God of War Ragnarök, and overall pretty good port, but there were issues. Alex highlighted a bunch of them in his review. But Alex, you have come to us today with good news.
Yes, I haven't retested everything, other things to do, but I did test two specific things based upon the patch notes that they mentioned. One of them was talking about essentially improving the fact that the game has, when you go through portals on the PC version post-launch and pre-launch, there was a really noticeable loading in of assets after the fact, which was a bit absurd because it didn't happen on like base PlayStation 4. It just seemed to be some sort of oversight. Well, testing the most recent patch versus the previous one, it is all gone from the perspective of at least using this one portal from the Realm Between Realms into like the first like dwarfen area of the game. So it is fixed up, nice and neat, alongside other issues that I hope they fix up in the near future. I really want still to look at the Zen 2 performance in this game. Another thing that they didn't mention in the patch notes, but I saw some weird, I got linked on Twitter to a thread saying like, oh, they fixed their tessellation performance, and I just played it and I was like, they didn't fix it, it's the exact same on my end. But then Twitter user Nasser, who I've interacted with over a number of times over the years, mentioned that they reinstalled their drivers or installed a more recent driver, and then the performance for the tessellation in the Realm Between Realm areas was better. And I was like, what's going on there? So I thought, okay, well, let me just delete my shader cache and have the game recompile shaders. Lo and behold, here's the footage of it pre-recompiling shaders, and here's the footage of it after compiling shaders. It's running at 2x the frame rate.
Okay.
Not good. So basically, I think after the patch, it was still using some older compiled shaders there, and forcing it to recompile them fixed the performance of this Realm Between Realms area, at least for tessellation. Now, the tessellation there still is not actually the same quality as PlayStation 5, but the performance is fixed now, so I presume they can maybe go back and make that tessellation at least par with the PlayStation 5 quality level. But it is a bit weird. I've seen this before in a number of other games where shaders don't always recompile when they should based upon certain things happening. The thing where it should always happen is if you reinstall a driver or install a new driver. Some games don't do that well. For example, Dead Space Remake on PC doesn't do that at all. So if you reinstall a driver and reboot up the game there, it'll have shader compilation stutter everywhere, regardless of what you do. It's awful. But here they do it well, but it seems like the patch didn't kick off a new shader compilation, at least from my perspective, when it maybe should have, because that fixed performance in this area. So things are getting better. There's hopefully some more things on the way. I do think they still need to fix Zen 2 performance. I think also there is maybe some issues of HDR quality differences between PS4, PS5 and PC, but I haven't examined them myself. So I'm just going off what other users are saying. And kind of lastly, I still think they need to add in those strange ray traced cube maps, because they are a quality win there, but they're not found on the PC version. And once they do that, I think you're looking at a really faithful recreation of the port. But right now it seems like in a good place, at least performance wise, for most users, which is great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's cool. I mean, it did seem to be the case that, Jetpack Interactive, who carried out the lion's share of the porting work, they're actually a really small outfit, right? Much smaller than Nixis.
Oh yeah, it's 4 engineers, and then the artists and QA help and oversight from Sony Santa Monica then to come in and say this works, this doesn't work, etc. And that's nothing in comparison to other studios. I think. Yeah, I really respect their work here. I just wish it has nothing to do with them. I just wish there was a drive from Sony's perspective to ensure the amount of time and checking against the PlayStation versions to make sure things are all right, like the missing visual effects, which I don't think are fixed as of this patch. That's a thing that has actually happened through a lot of games that are ported to PC, where like almost every game I think I've checked out ported to PC beyond Sackboy had like some sort of missing visual issues in comparison to the PlayStation version. Either textures don't load or an effect is missing. Like The Last of Us was one of the more, and even the Nathan Drake. It's not the Nathan Drake collection. It's the two UC. Yeah, the Thieves.
The Legacy of Thieves.
Legacy of Thieves, yeah.
Yes.
Legacy of Thieves collection also has visual issues, like, and performance issues, but it's a whole other thing. But I would just really love from the Sony perspective that they let these games have enough oversight in comparison to the PlayStation original to see that users aren't getting a worse experience visually on PC at launch with top-end hardware. And I think because it's not doing them any favors in terms of word of mouth on a game's release. Performance ones are always bad word of mouth, but then if anyone does a comparison like we do, then it makes the port lose almost like all that prestige, because people are like, oh, it's actually inferior visually to the PlayStation version. Kind of, what's the point at that point? It's like, so I hope Sony learns that lesson eventually. They don't seem to have learned it yet, though.
I think there's a lot of learnings going on, particularly in the wake of Helldivers 2, actually producing monster revenues for them simply because it was day and date. As to whether they want to pursue day and date, doesn't seem like they do. But on the flip side, you've got to get the maximal return from in revenue perspective from the vast amounts of money these games are costing to make these days. So it kind of makes sense. It's a tricky one for Sony for sure. Any thoughts, Oliver?
No, I just think that, for God of War Ragnarok, it looks pretty great on PS5. It runs pretty great on the consoles there. From everything I've seen from PC, there's like some smaller issues there, but it runs pretty well on PC. Just not a super ambitious game from a visual perspective. It looks great. I think what they're doing is great, especially relative to that 2018 game. But it is very much a PS4 game at its core, so it is a little bit disappointing to see some of those issues on PC, but I'm glad they're being addressed, I suppose. But yeah, to me, this is kind of a game that I look at and I'm like, I just play this on console and have some simplicity, not tear my hair out too much and just enjoy that experience, because it is pretty similar to that PC experience, I think, for the most part. I mean, you're not getting like 4K 120 there, but you are getting a pretty good, solid experience on console there. So
60 FPS mode is just really good. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. Final news story of the week, and wow, what can I say about this one? At the time of filming this, yesterday, Microsoft and indeed GSE Game World actually released a documentary, War Game, The Making of Stalker 2. First-hand account from the studio on the making of Stalker 2 in what is extraordinarily challenging circumstances. The documentary is kind of top and tailed by the game's first public reveal, which was at Gamescom 2023. But then we kind of go back and see the story of how things unfolded in the Ukraine as Stalker 2 was being developed. Alex, we've both watched this, and it's not pleasant to watch in some areas, but it's hugely instructional about the kind of challenges that were facing the developers here. Remarkable stuff.
Yeah, I think it is a well-produced documentary with enough footage from different times during development. It seems like they always had a camera running for a lot of it, which is interesting. Instead of it having to be reconstructed after the fact. And I found that very well done, well produced in that aspect. And just from the documentary is actually almost not about the making of Stalker 2. And I think that is better. It's better for it. They only really talk about the game Stalker 2 pretty briefly, about the idea of it kind of being representative of the ideals of what is happening in Ukraine, of just like a level of freedom and saying like what we are about. The game kind of emphasizes that in its more freeform design. That's like the part where they kind of tie it back into the overall narrative. But most of the video is like about them showing the game off the first time, the journey to get there at all, and then a lot of retrospective actually about Stalker's meaning to Ukraine as a country, and its kind of like meaning as a game, and how it ties into the current war. And I think that is really compelling stuff. And I had not seen anyone from Ukraine talking about Stalker before, and to realize it is like a cultural touchstone for them. I think that's something I don't see being born in the West and raised in the West. And I had a very different experience with Stalker when I was younger. You know, I was super excited about it. I played it, but it wasn't something that I thought was like, you know, this massive cultural phenomenon. But for them, it is, and it was, and it's very important to them. And so they try to bring that into the sequel. And through the backdrop and actually it takes frontal stage in the video for most of the documentary, is the fact that they started producing the game and prepared making the game as the war was breaking out and the invasion was occurring. And the stories are not exactly easy to get through. So if you do watch this video, which I do recommend watching it, go into it with knowing the fact they're going to talk about things and they're going to show things that are actually disturbing. It's definitely not something you can go through really easily, I would say. That's for certain. But when they kind of get to the end of it and they talk about what the game means for them, I think there's just like this great full circle that they do, because they start off with like Gamescom showing and they come back to it at the end about, you know, just what the game means to them and the kind of their personal story while trying to make this game. It's incredible. And yeah, big props to the developers at GSC for even making the game. I think most places where a war would break out and the entire country's, you know, would be flipped on its head in terms of what your priorities are. The fact that they can even bring it out is pretty miraculous, actually. And I also want to just really praise the developers too for taking care of their people who work at the company. There's this kind of story in there about them all, like a lot of the developers leaving the country as the invasion started, which, wow. I mean, imagine as a workplace, you have to plan to move people's families in case of a war breaking out. And that's kind of what they had to do. And it's harrowing, and must have been ridiculous for them. So bravo.
There were a couple of moves, weren't there? There were a couple of moves for the studio. First of all, they moved to the west of the country, thinking that if they were within 50 miles of a NATO country, they wouldn't be receiving missiles, but then there were developers who didn't want to leave, who wanted to stay where they were. Other developers who joined the armed forces.
Yeah.
It's an astonishing series of human stories about this conflict, and the game is almost like, obviously it's the thematic glue towards the whole documentary, but it's really about the people who are making the games and the challenges that they're facing there. And I think they moved first of all to the west of the Ukraine, but then they moved into Czech Republic.
Yeah.
It's like big culture shocks there. They didn't really know how to operate in the Czech Republic at all.
Yeah.
Astonishing stories.
Yeah. And all throughout it too, there's a lot of the people that stayed in Ukraine and some that joined the armed forces they're also interviewed there. But there's people working in Ukraine, still working on the game, and they show like little vignettes of like someone programming on their desk and then looking out the window as the air raid siren starts off and saying, "This is how I wake up every morning." Incredible stuff. So I'm going to be covering this game. In light of everything, though, it's not an easy coverage because I'm a little worried about games always coming out, especially in the modern day, especially an Unreal Engine game. I'll give it my best. I'll give it my all. I will be as clean as I always am about these kind of things. But in the back of my mind, I will realize this is a game that was made under ridiculous circumstances. So you have to keep that in mind.
It's interesting that that we actually cameoed in that documentary, because there was a mixed reaction to that Gamescom 2023 gameplay demo.
That's
All
funny.
I can really say is that the documentary is framed entirely within that context, that Gamescom context almost.
Yeah,
so
funny.
the stuff that we were saying about it in 2024 Gamescom, which was a lot more positive, it just doesn't really make the cut there, which is a bit of a shame. But
yeah, it is a shame.
Yeah,
I hope people don't think I'm a stalker hater or something as a result of that. I don't even. Yeah, no, I'm a big Stalker fan actually. So, I just I think right now getting the game out, then getting a PlayStation version out, and also they mentioned in some interviews, I think that they're going to plan on adding in things like hardware ray tracing after release. Right now it's using software Lumen. So we already know that there's going to be some sort of iteration post-release. So It's not the complete article at launch here, at least in terms of their eventual goals. But Stalker wasn't either. That game's been patched a lot, and it had so many, quasi sequels with the expansions, and some of them are standalone. So yeah, just incredible. I highly recommend everyone watch it.
Okay, so let's move on to supporter Q&A. Every week I post on our Patreon saying, hey, why don't you suggest some topics and questions for inclusion in DF Direct Weekly? And we've got a whole bunch of good questions to go through this week. I've actually grouped the first two together. It's a topic that keeps coming up, but well, let's tackle it. First question from some guy person. The Strix Halo parts were designed for Steam Machines 2.0. Convince me otherwise. Strix Halo is basically a gigantic APU that AMD is making, that is kind of very console-like in some respects, in that it's pairing a gigantic GPU with a much smaller CPU. Typically doesn't happen. I guess there's going to be an AI MPU element in it as well. This question from Paul Trainer. Hey, hi DF, do you think now is the time for a new Steam box? For the 700 quid price of a PS5 Pro, could a SteamOS living room mini PC be built? If not, how much? If not, how much do you imagine a similarly spec'd box would need to cost? Oliver?
Yes, well, Strix Halo certainly does seem like a pretty meaty choice for a Steam Machine console. In particular, when you think about a Steam Machine console that would kind of try to reach that, like, I don't know, Alienware Alpha kind of form factor, that kind of more console-like form factor, I definitely think that for sure those like SoCs, those APUs are a better fit for those devices in all likelihood. In terms of the Steam Box thing, I think that's just the Steam Box concept in general is like really appetizing to me, especially after spending a lot of time in Bazite, a lot of time with SteamOS, It's just a really good operating system for a console. But moving on to the question, I think if you're expecting something equivalent to a PS5 Pro for a PS5 Pro price tag, you're probably going to be disappointed because you're not really dealing with an SoC. You don't have a unified memory model. There's more complexity, more cost. You don't have the potential for a subsidy either. I don't think there is a subsidy. And also the scale of what you're producing is much less, I think, as well, than what Sony is trying to achieve with the PlayStation 5 Pro. They're going to produce many millions of units of that. You're not going to see that same scale. You're not going to see that same efficiency here. So I just don't think you're going to see the same price. Judging in terms of like the PC market at the moment, I think maybe you could achieve something pretty similar for like, I don't know, $1,000 seems like a pretty safe price point to pick, maybe a little bit less there. But I don't think that in this case there'd be that much contrast between the Steam box price and a PC price here, because you're dealing with basically the same components as far as we're aware. I don't think there'd be anything too special for the Steam box in this case. And in all likelihood, Windows OEM keys are going to be really cheap as well for those OEMs to produce and for you to obtain separately if you do choose to go that route. So it's not really a situation where you'd expect a lot of price divergence, especially price divergence that would favor that Steam box. I think it'd be basically the same price. And in that case, I think the PS5 Pro would have a substantial edge in terms of price performance, but that's kind of almost not really the point of these PC devices, or indeed the Steam box as it would be termed here. I think it's more that ecosystem that you're looking for, possibly on the Steam box side of things that you wouldn't be getting on the console side.
I was just looking at the specs, and 120 watt TDP for Strix Halo, 64 gigs of memory, 16 Zen 5 cores, 40 compute units RDNA 3.5. So just, immediately I'd say that the power window and also the compute unit count suggests that it's kind of more base PlayStation 5 level than Pro.
Right.
So I do think they could do a pretty good console with it, but it probably would be more of a base PlayStation 5 competitor. And in that respect, suddenly you're looking at a much more constrained budget. If they could get a machine out for $500 similar to a PS5, that would be quite an achievement. And as to whether it would be able to run as well as a PlayStation 5, who knows? Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by the concept in general. I think the Steam Deck's nice feature set and kind of ease of use of working is a great strength that could be applied to a little box that you put next to a television. I'd be curious about other things about it, like, okay, like what is its, does it come with a controller? Like, what controllers does it per default come with if they were to try and sell it? I'll also be kind of curious about, that we've seen, Oliver is going to be taking a look at this, but we've seen like the Steam OS kind of applied to other hardware. What other things would they then improve upon from there to make the desktop experience even more compelling on a television? Because this right now focused on this handheld device, right? And one of the cool things about Steam Deck is you can like sleep it with a button, like how you sleeping something with this device. I think it's a really great idea, and I'd actually love to see Valve do it. I'm just like curious how they would solve some issues, and I don't think it would go price performance competitor with PS5. I think they just can't do that for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a tricky one for sure. I mean, I do think it's probably going to be the case that there will be a push towards living room friendly PCs, and there was a push back in the day. I mean, Oliver pointed out the Alienware Alpha. There's also the Alienware X51. I just think maybe that model forward, Windows has got to get itself sorted out in terms of being a more versatile operating system for devices like, a living room PC. You just know that Valve is going to do the same thing. And I'm not sure whether it's down to the likes of Valve to be producing hardware, but they can certainly provide the software and the operating system, and they've got the ecosystem. So I think maybe it's sort of Steam Machines 2.0 could be somewhat similar to Steam Machines 1.0. The difference being this time that a lot of the problems have already been solved, and it's just down to the market to produce the hardware. This question from Ephraim the Dream. Greetings, Foundryman! Exclamation point. Perhaps you can answer this age-old question. Just what on earth has Naughty Dog been working on? For PS1, they developed Crash 1-3 and Crash Team Racing. For PS2, they developed Jak 1-3 and Jak X Combat Racing. For PS3, they developed 3 Uncharted games and The Last of Us, including the Left Behind DLC. For PlayStation 4, they developed Uncharted 4, the Uncharted DLC, and T-Loop 2. And 4 years into PS5, we have absolutely nothing. Side question, am I the only one who thinks they should have left The Last of Us just be a one-off and started fresh on a new IP?
Interesting.
Cheers! Exclamation point. Oliver, you're the man we go to for all things T-Loop.
T-Loop.
And T-Loop, yes. And there is a point here in that Naughty Dog's output for PlayStation 5 has essentially been almost like a PS4 greatest hits. We haven't actually seen a Naughty Dog game for PlayStation 5 yet. Surely logic would suggest that it is The Last of Us Part 3.
Well, the one exception to that would be The Last of Us Part 1, which is a PS5 native title and is only in PS5 and PC, but that's also not really, I think, what people have in mind when they think of as a new Naughty Dog effort this generation as well. Personally, I think it's a new IP. I think that all signs point to that from the hints they've given, from job listings they've posted. That's kind of the vibe that they're giving off at the moment. I think it is a new IP. I think it possibly is something science fiction related, again, judging from what they have been posting a little bit. Yes. But also, if you look at the Grounded 2 documentary that they released to coincide with The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, they do talk about a concept for The Last of Us Part 3, not specifics, but just that they do have a concept for it, whereas previously they didn't really have a good concept for that. But I'm not sure if that would be a new concept for a new game, or a season of the TV show, or both. And it certainly does seem like with the realities of game production that it would probably lend itself more readily to a TV season, because if you think about, okay, we have a great idea for The Last of Us Part 3 in like 2022, 2021, turning that into a game, that's going to take a lot of time, but they're actively producing HBO seasons of that television show, so perhaps it is in the pipe for that kind of deal. But personally, like answering that last question there, I like The Last of Us quite a lot. I think it's great they pushed a sequel. I think if you look at what The Last of Us Part 2 did gameplay-wise, if you look at what it did narratively, I think it just stands alone in gaming, in my opinion, in terms of creating a really unique experience, in terms of creating something really special. I know some people maybe won't agree with that, but I think it's truly a great title, even if it is a bit of a, one of these Sony narrative-focused action-adventure type games that some people are not too warm to these days. But I think it's great they pursued a sequel with it. I think if they did a third game, that would be exciting, but I'm also excited to see what they would do with a new IP, because they have not had, they had Uncharted in like 2007, then The Last of Us in 2013, and nothing new since then. That's quite a long time, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, I guess the new IP thing is what interests me. There was some talk of them doing some sort of space game for a while. It was like called like Jagged. What was it called? Do you remember this, Oliver? Jagged Empire? Am I making something up? Shattered Empire. Post a comment on this web zone if you know. But either way, I would like to see also a return to a different style, because like third person shooting with like stealth mechanics is like kind of UC and that game, T-Lu. I would be interested in see them tackling an adventure game, kind of like they used to do. I think that would be really cool. It would also be different in the lineup of Sony games at that point, because that doesn't exist anymore. Those kind of more fun, platformy. I mean, Jak 1 is pretty cool game, right? I kind of would love to see them return to that style of game, and it would be different. And I imagine since it wouldn't be focusing on maybe photorealism, it could have a different turnaround time instead of 4K sweat and tear ducts. I think that there could be actually less artist time and maybe, something that we don't see too often these days. So that's the only thing I would feel about this, actually. But it is a bit sad that them working on that online game for a while really tanked whatever like they could have been producing. It is actually sad because I don't think their heart was maybe behind it the whole way, probably, given their studio culture. And it is good that they probably stopped it at the end of the day, because it would have just brought them into an endless cycle of, like Destiny, like of just producing Destiny stuff. And
content drops.
Yeah, that probably would have eaten the studio and changed it completely, which I don't think anyone who likes their games would like to see.
Well, I'll tell you what, Alex, I did enter some details into the web zone, and
Yes.
it turns out that the name of the leaked name, the project code name, apparently it's Strays Cross. Just for clarity.
What am I thinking of? I don't even know. Okay. Yeah. Straight Cross. But it was some sort of sci-fi thing.
I like Jagged Edge, though.
Yeah, Jagged Edge.
Yeah, that's a cooler code name.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one is pretty simple, comes from Daniel Bross. Hi, do you think the Switch 2 will be able to support the newest Unreal Engine 5 features? Now, this is an interesting question, of course, because one of the key reasons why the Nintendo Switch proved to be so successful was, it was a really good machine for third-party developers. And moving into this generation, a lot of those third-party developers are moving on to Unreal Engine 5. Alex, what do you make of this?
I mean, I think there's things that it'll just inevitably, by virtue of its hardware, it'll support things like Nanite. It'll support things like VSM. It will support Lumen. It could even support MegaLights, right? There's nothing stopping that. It's all about performance targets, and performance targets are overriding in this case. And I think that's where you'd see the stripping out of these things, and or maybe specific versions of those technologies just made for Switch, where they make different trade-offs to work in the first place. For example, like hardware Lumen. There's probably a way to make that run on Switch really well and compellingly, but it would have to have a different visual look, I would presume, and a different like budgeting than what you would just run on like a normal PC GPU. Or CPU for that matter. So yeah, I think there's going to be differences in that aspect, but I think just because by virtue of the architecture it's written for, that it'll support everything, as long as it's not too memory intensive, which is the one differentiating factor.
Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it does have support for all those technologies. I think MegaLights is the fact that it can be supported in on paper is maybe a little bit of over-promising in terms of what it could do in practice. But I mean, I expect that Unreal Engine 5 will run on Switch. I mean, they showed off Matrix Awakens on it, like a year ago? We saw that leak from the Gamescom, I think 2023 Nintendo briefing there. And I think it should be able to support all those technologies, and it should be able to support titles in much the same way that the Switch can support Unreal Engine 4. I think the question is, how well do those games scale? And maybe some games scale really well, like the aforementioned Jouissant. Perhaps there are some games that scale pretty well. And perhaps Gears of War 6 does not scale so well. E-Data does not scale so well. So maybe there's a bit of a gradation there. But certainly it can run those technologies, and it should be able to do at least a creditable job of that, at least judging from what Epic has been demoing and from what Nintendo has been messaging about their upcoming hardware to development partners. It should be kind of in that realm of acceptability, at least relative to.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think, we just need to set expectations for when people say, it runs the Matrix Awakens. We haven't seen how it runs the Matrix Awakens.
True, very true.
So, it's not as if you could just roll out your PlayStation 5 B-roll and say, hey, this is what it's doing. It's likely going to have some compromises, and that's absolutely fine for a mobile-based platform. But it's going to be a supported platform for Unreal Engine 5 for sure. So I'm sure we'll see some excellent results, and I'd love to see it. Right, I'd really love to see what it's capable of doing. But there's just so many question marks with Switch 2 at the moment. But I guess we'll get clarity at some point. Okay, let's move on. This question from Edna Mode. It's another Switch 2 question. Do you think the Switch successor can compete with the Steam Deck in handheld modes at circa 5 watts? Does the next Switch, quote unquote, need to compete with these handhelds in this new market, or have we all lost the point because third-party performance is irrelevant to the next Switch's success, just like the current one? I kind of think it is irrelevant, but Oliver?
I don't think it matters that much relative to the Steam Deck. I could be wrong, but I don't think that people are generally trading off the Steam Deck against the Switch, or at least vice versa. I don't think they're really trading off for the Steam Deck, that many Nintendo Switch users. I think in part you see that just because like the Steam Deck has sold maybe 5 million units, maybe 4 million, something probably in the single digits, millions there, the 9 figures. Whereas Switch is like 150 million or something, 140, 150 million. It's a lot of units there. But I also think like with the Steam Deck, just in terms of how it actually functions, it's a bit clunkier, and you don't have the Nintendo software on the device, and you don't have the docking functionality. And there are a lot of things that kind of push you away from that concept. If you are someone who's in the market for a Switch, that might put you off of the Steam Deck concept. In terms of its competitiveness with Steam Deck, I think we just don't know at the moment, but you've got Ampere at 8 nanometers potentially versus RDNA 2 at 7. That is, kind of a similar generation of product there, but the power budget is much less. So it really kind of does depend on, I think, a lot of those technologies like DLSS, depends developers optimizing for the hardware, depends on that stuff working and being pretty strong there, because I don't think that you're going to get, like this commentator is saying, maybe it'll be a T239 at like 5 watts and not a Vango APU at 15 watts. That's a pretty big power gulf to traverse. So you're going to need some optimization for that to actually work and be a competitive experience.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Alex?
Yeah, I don't think the multi-platform performance is such a big deal at all. I'll echo everything you said. The only time I think it matters is maybe if there's a launch period where there's a product drought, and like they need things to show up on the Switch, and ports could fill that little gap. But that would just be one part of this product's lifetime of releases, and it wouldn't actually probably matter in comparison to the next Zelda, Smash Bros, Mario Kart, whatever. That's why people buy the Switch.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think there's a lot of ways to look at this, but the power gulf between a 15-watt Steam Deck processor and whatever the Switch 2 is doing in portable mode, it's going to heavily favor the Steam Deck, right? However, on the flip side, you're going to have developers specifically targeting that platform on Nintendo Switch in a way that they don't really do for the Steam Deck. You get some games that have like Steam Deck support, but developers aren't going out of their way to create a specific Steam Deck version of that game. That's the difference there. That's what makes all the difference. And I just don't think we should be worrying too much about how Switch 2 is going to work in handheld mode, because the stuff that we've seen on the first Switch is just phenomenal, and I suspect it's all going to carry over to Switch 2 as well. With that, let's move on. Final question here, this one from Tamarator. Hello, DF gents. What do you think of the PlayStation 5 Pro not selling out like many people expected? Do you think it's a sign of soft sales, or did we finally graduate the supply-limited era that plagues the current console generation launch? Thanks for the fantastic content. So the reason I put this question in is because people seem to think now that if something doesn't sell out at launch, it's a complete disaster, and we should be immensely worried. And yet it used to be the case, I think, probably before the pandemic, that you could go into a shop and buy a console and it was a perfectly normal behavior.
Normal interaction.
And nobody was like predicting the doom of the PlayStation 3. That wasn't really supply constrained at launch. So I'm curious what you make about this, because obviously it is tied into the concept that the Pro is actually a really expensive machine. Should we be worried about it not selling out, Oliver?
I think it's hard to say. I do think that probably demand will be a little bit softer than the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X relative to those base consoles that generation, maybe just because the price is significantly higher this time around instead of kind of coming in at about the price of the launch price of those base machines last time around, which was a blessing relative to this for sure. But that's probably fine from Sony's perspective, I think, as well, because they're probably not trying to sell 100 million PlayStation 5 Pros. They're trying to sell 100 million PlayStation 5 family consoles. And if some of those happen to be PS5 Pros, that's great. But, you know, because they're making bigger margins in those consoles, but they're not trying to, you know, they're probably more interested in the overall health of the platform than what specific segment is going to that higher end console. But without knowledge of their internal operations and their scale, we don't really know what the case is there. And indeed, like, I remember going back, like, this is going back quite a ways, but like 14 years, 15 years, the new iPhones used to sell out like day of, right? They used to sell out tremendously. And Apple was shipping maybe 20 million of them a quarter or 15 million of them a quarter, but they were shipping and having issues with production. And so that got reflected in the devices selling out for a couple months after launch. Nowadays, when new iPhones launch, they're moving like 50 million a quarter, but they never sell out, right? So there's a certain logic there where if the supply chain is getting better, actually, maybe you're not seeing that disruption, and maybe that isn't a sign of necessarily weak sales. It could be perfectly fine because you just don't know what their end of the equation looks like.
Alex?
I think it makes sense, like what you're just saying there, the supply side being up to snuff this time around, along with the price, because it was like a competitive node at the beginning in the COVID crisis, and now it's not on the most competitive node, the SoC, and there is not a, the pandemic still exists in the background, obviously here. I won't say COVID doesn't currently exist. I just got a vaccination for it. But there's no government mandated like lockdowns and things like that at the moment. So it's a very different time, and I think that is reflected. And I don't think Sony, like you said, Oliver, I don't think they need to have a lot of these sold if they're making more money per unit, especially. That's just gravy for them. They're happy about that. And the only thing I would be hoping in time is that they sell enough units to incentivize developers to make good versions of PS5 Pro, like patches and stuff like that. Because if it doesn't sell a lot, you can see the incentive to make those things really worthwhile and great instead of just, oh, it's a res bump or the DRS is different or something. Like that's pretty boring, right? So you'd want it to sell well enough to incentivize developers to make good PS5 Pro versions. Probably.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I agree entirely. I haven't really got too much more to say to that. I do think, though, that Sony has gone out of its way to make sure that we aren't getting what were the equivalent of 1440p modes on the PS4 Pro. It's just kind of like the basic upgrade. Stuff like PSSR should be more impactful there. So I'm hoping. I think they learned a lot of lessons from the PS4 Pro. In terms of whether it sells out or not, well, the weird thing is, obviously pre-launch, there's like phases of stock. You've already seen some sellouts, which are now not sellouts because new stock has arrived. It's all a bit weird in terms of judging the success of a piece of consumer electronics based on the fact that you can't actually buy it. It's just a bit weird. But anyway, that was the final question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it, ring bells for notifications that may or may not appear. But please do consider store.digitalfoundry.net to access our merchandising wares. And in fact, the DF supporter program in general, get early access to the Direct, early access to a lot of content, the chance to contribute to the Direct. There's a lot of stuff going on there, including a brilliant community. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.